Good evening. Today we'll be discussing anesthetic management of craniosynostosis. I'll be giving a brief overview of what craniosynostosis is and the various surgical options that are available, and then we'll move on to the anesthetic management. So craniosynostosis refers to the premature fusion of one or more cranial sutures, resulting in an abnormal skull development as well as an head shape. And this abnormal head shape can have serious psychological implications on a child who is growing up. On the right hand side of the screen, the figure shows the normal skull sutures. We have the metopic suture between the two frontal bones, the coronal suture between the frontal and the parietal bone, the sagittal suture between two parietal bones, and the lambdoidal suture between the parietal and the occipital bones. And this is the anterior fontanelle, and this is the posterior fontanelle. So this premature fusion results in failure of normal bone growth perpendicular to the concerned suture. And as a result of this, compensatory bone growth occurs at other suture sites, resulting in characteristic head shapes. The incidence is about 1 in 2,500 to 3,000 live births. And this may occur as an isolated condition in 80% of the cases, but it can occur as part of a syndrome when it is known as syndromic craniosynostosis in 20% of the cases. So these are all the anatomical variants that are there. This is the figure of a normal skull with all the sutures intact that we saw in the previous feature also. This is trigonocephaly. If you look at this picture, in trigonocephaly, the metopic suture is fused and the skull takes on a triangular profile. This is synostotic scaphocephaly, in which the sagittal suture is fused and the skull looks tower shaped or elongated. This is synostotic brachycephaly, which is also here, both the coronal sutures are fused. So this is known as bicoronal craniosynostosis. Here we have synostotic posterior plagiocephaly, in which the lambdoidal suture is fused early. And here we have synostotic anterior plagiocephaly, where unicoronal, it's also known as unicoronal synostosis, where the one of the coronal sutures is fused prematurely. And this is deformational posterior plagiocephaly, where all the sutures are open. Now, in isolated craniosynostosis, generally only one suture is involved, whereas in syndromic craniosynostosis, more often than not, multiple sutures are involved. So coming to the syndromes which are associated with craniosynostosis, most of them are because of mutations in the FGFR genes. So the commonest syndrome that is associated with craniosynostosis is Mewinke syndrome, which is due to a mutation in FGFR3, and inheritance is autosomal dominant. Mewinke syndrome accounts for about 30% of cases of syndromic craniosynostosis. The common synostosis here is uni or bicoronal. The facial features are mid-face hypoplasia. Compared to the other syndromes, the facial features are usually milder in Mewinke syndrome, but these patients generally have low frequency sensorineural hearing loss, and potential developmental delay may be there. It's milder compared to other syndromes, but there is higher risk of reoperation compared to non-syndromic craniosynostosis. Then coming to the most commonly studied syndrome, Apert syndrome. Apert syndrome is because of mutation in FGFR2 gene, and inheritance is autosomal dominant. Most commonly, the synostosis seen is bicoronal, and it results in brachycephaly. Facial features, there can be severe maxillary hypoplasia, low set ears, cleft palate, exorbitism. Exorbitism refers to shallow eye sockets, which results in potential dislocation of the eyes can also be there in severe cases. And protection of the eyes is one of the emergency indications for emergency surgery in craniosynostosis. These patients, the primary anesthetic consideration is a potential difficult mask ventilation because of midfacial hypoplasia, resulting in distorted nasopharyngeal anatomy. They often have obstructive sleep apnea, and because of exorbitism and proptosis, corneal abrasions and eye injuries can be common in these patients. Coming to the next syndrome, which is Crouzon syndrome. Crouzon syndrome is also similar to Apert syndrome. It's because of mutations in FGFR2 or FGFR3. The commonest synostosis in this case is also bicoronal. But what we need to remember in Crouzon syndrome, in addition to what is there in Apert, is cervical spine abnormalities, which are present in 1/3 of cases. So this is an added dimension when it comes to airway management. Therefore, thorough evaluation of the cervical spine before surgery is warranted in these cases. Coming to Pfeiffer syndrome is because of mutations in FGFR1 and 2 gene, and this is inheritance is again autosomal dominant. The synostosis can range from bicoronal to fusion of all sutures, resulting in clover leaf skull. If you go back to the introductory slide, This is what a clover leaf is, and this is what a clover leaf skull looks like. All the sutures are fused and it takes on the appearance of a clover leaf. In Pfeiffer syndrome also, midface hypoplasia of varying degrees can be seen. These patients have broad thumbs, wide great toes, partial syndactyly. Another thing, this complex syndactyly that is associated in Apert syndrome can even be diagnosed antenatally. Coming to Carpenter syndrome, this is one of the syndromes associated with craniosynostosis, which has an autosomal recessive inheritance, unlike most other syndromes which have autosomal dominant inheritance. In this case, coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal sutures may be involved. This also has midface hypoplasia. And in addition to that, these patients, 50% of them may have cardiac defects. So they have to be evaluated for a cardiological evaluation has to be done prior to surgery with special emphasis on a 2D echo. Then Seidfried-Hodgson syndrome is because of mutations in TWIST or FGFR2 genes. These patients generally have normal intelligence, but ptosis of upper eyelid may be there with towering forehead, low set hairline, and facial asymmetry with a nasal septal deviation. Coming to clinical features, both isolated as well as syndromic craniosynostosis may lead to raised ICP. Now, the predominant feature is obviously the obviously visible abnormal skull shape. Other than that, both isolated and syndromic craniostosis may lead to raised ICP. However, raised ICP is more common in syndromic craniosynostosis, and the causes include hydrocephalus, airway obstruction, craniocerebral disproportion, that is, the skull is too small for the brain, and abnormal venous drainage. And symptoms of raised ICP can be headache, irritability, seizure, developmental delay, and in severe cases, blindness and sudden death. So treatment of craniosynostosis is predominantly surgical, but a multidisciplinary approach involving neurosurgeons, craniofacial surgeons, plastic surgeons, trained anesthesiologists, preferably a pediatric anesthesiologist. It's desirable to have a multidisciplinary team to improve outcomes. And surgical correction is not solely for cosmesis. Early correction also promotes normal brain growth as well as cognitive development. And indications for an emergency surgery include immediate threat to airway or eyes or presence of raised ICP. Timing of elective surgery is controversial, and there are various surgical options available for craniosynostosis. So coming to the pros and cons of an early or a late surgery. Early surgery advantages are increased malleability of a softer bone, and because of rapid ongoing brain growth, it encourages continued growth of the cranial vault. Whereas disadvantages include complex surgery and dangers of anesthesia in a young infant. There is blood loss, which is a major concern in craniosynostosis surgery, can be exaggerated in very small infants because of the small blood volume and comparatively large head size compared to the body. And there is an increased likelihood of redo surgery at a later date. With late surgery, the advantages, the advantages are reduced incidence of complications related to surgery and anesthesia and a reduced likelihood of reoperation. Whereas the disadvantages include surgery can be more challenging because of increased deformity and reduced malleability of the bone. Also, small defects may not ossify, so it necessitates bone grafts and more extensive surgical procedures. So to balance these challenges, surgery is often performed at 8 to 12 months of age. Surgical options, there are extensive surgical options as well as minimally invasive and endoscopic surgeries have also come up now. Extended strip craniectomy, there is a high incidence of restenosis. Spring-assisted cranioplasty is actually a minimally invasive procedure, and both these operations are usually performed for sagittal synostosis. Total vault reconstruction, frontal orbital advancement and remodeling, and posterior expansion and remodeling are extensive surgeries which are time-consuming and which generally incur major blood loss, and there is risk of venous air embolism. So a trained anesthesiologist is an extremely important part of the team. An endoscopic suture release with subsequent post-operative helmet molding is also an option. As is obvious, this is an endoscopic procedure. The advantages of endoscopic procedures are a reduced time. As a result of that, blood loss may be reduced, and also the incidence of venous air embolism has been found to be less with endoscopic procedures. This is an overview of the surgical options. Extended strip craniectomy is generally performed at the age of 4 to 6 months. The length of procedure is typically 1 to 3 hours, and it's usually done for sagittal synostosis. Spring-assisted cranioplasty, as you can see, the time is only 45 minutes to 1.5 hours, and this may not even need invasive monitoring in certain centers where they are used to doing the procedure. It's a short procedure and it's minimally invasive. Total vault reconstruction, on the other hand, is performed in relatively older infants, and the surgery can be pretty time consuming. Arterial line is mandatory. there can be major blood loss, and so blood conservation strategies have to be planned ahead. Minimally invasive endoscopic surgeries, they take less time. Frontoorbital remodeling and posterior calvarial vault expansion are both time-consuming surgeries, and invasive vascular access is not only desirable but also considered mandatory in most of these cases. Now coming to the actual anesthetic management of surgical repair of craniosynostosis. So starting with the preoperative assessment, airway assessment is the most important. As we've seen in the previous slides, syndromic craniosynostosis carries a significant risk of difficult airway. So a review of previous records if available, if these children have undergone any radiological procedures under sedation, if those records are available, they can be helpful in planning and airway management. And adequate planning for an anticipated difficult airway has to be done, especially in case of syndromic craniosynostosis. So all the difficult airway equipment should be readily available, and most importantly, trained anesthesiologists with adequate expertise in management of pediatric difficult airway should be readily available in the theatre. Assessment of the respiratory system. We have to ask for history of any recent upper respiratory tract infection, because that can be a risk factor for significant intraoperative respiratory complications and postoperative morbidity. A lot of these children, especially those with syndromic craniosynostosis, have obstructive sleep apnea, and this is primarily because of the mid-phase hypoplasia, which distorts the nasopharyngeal anatomy. So these patients, we have to anticipate difficult mask ventilation, and adjuncts for mask ventilation have to be readily available in the OT. Also, a proportion of patients with obstructive sleep apnea may be requiring a continuous positive airway pressure. And patients who are on CPAP may require a tracheostomy 1 to 2 weeks prior to the definitive craniofacial surgery to ease the process of induction, and also to better manage the postoperative course in these patients. In addition to the challenges that the respiratory system poses for anesthesia management, chronic upper airway obstruction also has implications in terms of elevation of ICP as well as cardiovascular problems like pulmonary artery hypertension. And these also have to be kept in mind before we proceed to anesthetize these patients. Cardiological evaluation is essential, especially in syndromic craniosynostosis like Carpenter syndrome, in which 50% of patients can have cardiological anomalies. And also it's important to look for a patent foramen ovale, because most of these children are young infants. They may have a patent foramen ovale, which is a risk factor for paradoxical air embolism in the setting of a venous air embolism. So 2D echo is more or less required in all the patients. Correction of preoperative anemia is crucial, because the surgery itself incurs massive blood loss. So we have to seize every opportunity to correct anemia preoperatively until and unless it's an emergency surgery. And this can be achieved with iron and folic acid supplements and erythropoietin injections. We'll be discussing this in further detail in the subsequent slides. Parental counseling is extremely important, especially pertaining to complications which are related to surgery and anesthesia, with special emphasis on major blood loss and venous air embolism. Also, the possible need for postoperative ventilation. And evaluation for features of raised ICP is essential, because that in addition to ensuring that we do not allow any intraoperative factor that will worsen ICP like hypoxia, hypercarbia, hypotension. In addition to that, our anesthetic induction technique also has to be modified if a child with raised ICP comes for surgery. One thing that I've not mentioned here is involving a psychologist, child psychologist in the team is also very important, because due to if the surgery is being performed in relatively older children, they often have psychological issues and inferiority complex because of their appearance. So that has to be addressed adequately by a psychologist. Coming to preoperative investigations, a complete hemogram is an absolute must. We have to know the baseline hemoglobin. It's a major procedure with the potential for massive blood loss. Renal function tests with electrolytes are needed, because large fluid shifts are anticipated during the course of most of these surgeries. A coagulation profile is not mandatory but desirable, because in case of massive transfusion, coagulopathy may develop during the course of the surgery and even post-operatively. So we need a reference to compare with post-op. 2D echo, particularly to look for a patent foramen ovale, especially in children with syndromic craniosynostosis, or where there is an obvious history of cardiac disease. Blood grouping and cross-matching is absolutely essential, and barring the most minor surgeries, cross-matched blood should be available in the operation theater before surgical incision. Radiological investigations, chest x-ray if there is history of recurrent respiratory tract infections, and x-ray of the neck and cervical spine in case of anticipated difficult airway, especially if a child with Crouzon syndrome, in which case cervical spine abnormalities are found in 1/3 of the patients. Unlike other neurosurgeries where neuroimaging is mandatory, CT may not always be required in these cases because the diagnosis is largely clinical based on the appearance of the child. But CT may be required for advanced 3D reconstructions to facilitate surgical planning. Coming to induction of anesthesia, if it's a very young infant, pre-medication may not be needed. However, if we do use pre-medications, we have to keep in mind their effect on ICP. So short-acting benzodiazepines like a small dose of midazolam may be preferable to long-acting sedatives like diazepam. Intravenous or inhalational anesthesia may be used depending on the expertise of anesthetists as well as the patient factors. Obviously, if there is a patient with raised ICP, intravenous induction would be preferable to inhalational induction because we know that inhalational anesthetics impair cerebral flow metabolism coupling in higher MAC, which is typically what is required for induction of anesthesia. However, when we're concerned about difficult airway, a gaseous induction with maintenance of spontaneous ventilation may be preferred in order to prevent sudden loss of airway. And airway adjuncts like oropharyngeal airways, nasopharyngeal airways should always be available in the OT to facilitate mass ventilation. A route of intubation and type of tracheal tube used varies between centers. A lot of centers prefer nasotracheal intubation because of the added stability that is provided by the tube in various positions that may be required for the surgery. And endotracheal tube position has to be confirmed by flexing as well as extending the neck because endobronchial intubation as well as inadvertent extubation are common. And we have to ensure that the tube is secured in place before the surgeons proceed with draping, because once the child is draped, access becomes next to impossible. And the tube has to be secured properly. In addition to adhesive, sutures have also been applied to secure these tubes. There is mention of it in literature, especially when nasal endotracheal tubes are used. They're frequently secured by suturing. And we have to ensure that all connections and tubings should be checked before draping and handing over the patient to the surgeon. Standard monitors like NIBP, ECG, and SpO2 are required. In addition, invasive arterial blood pressure monitoring is mandatory with the possible exception of endoscopic cases, but that too in centers which have adequate expertise in doing these cases. For centers which do not routinely do these procedures, an invasive arterial line is necessary. Adequate intravenous access, either to wide-bore IV cannula or preferably central venous catheter. Central venous catheter serves the dual purpose of allowing aspiration of air when venous air embolism occurs, and also infusion of large volumes and inotropes and vasopressors if necessary. Temperature monitoring is mandatory and methods of active warming should be instituted at the time of induction itself. Induction in these patients can be time consuming, difficult airway, intravenous invasive access in a very small child. So from the very beginning, we have to use active warming methods like forced air warming blankets, as well as fluid warmers if available to keep the child warm. Capnography is essential. Capnography can detect venous air embolism and is also important to titrate ventilation in these patients. Precordial Doppler is desirable in order to detect venous air embolism, but most centers rely on capnography for this purpose. Coming to positioning, careful positioning is essential to facilitate optimal surgical access as well as minimize complications related to surgery like venous air embolism. The positions commonly used are supine, prone, and modified prone. Modified prone position is also known as sphinx position. This is the sphinx position, the lateral profile of the child, where you can see that the head and neck is slightly hyperextended. So when this position is used, we have to take care to ensure that there is no direct pressure on the neck, and also excessive hyperextension of the neck should be avoided because it can result in damage and injury to the spinal cord. Adequate padding of pressure points as well as of invasive lines and monitoring leads in direct contact with the skin is essential. And protection of the eyes is extremely important, especially in the patients with Apert and Crouzon syndrome, where exorbitism with fluoride proptosis and corneal abrasions are there. We have to ensure that we use topical lubricants. Even temporary tarsorrhaphy has been described in literature. And when the child is position prone, head lifts every 15 minutes to avoid direct pressure on the eyes is important. Maintenance of anesthesia, since they're small children, volatile anesthetics are usually used in a mixture of air or oxygen. Nitrous oxide is usually avoided due to the risk of venous air embolism. Analgesia is maintained with opioids and intravenous paracetamol. The use of NSAIDs is controversial because they might contribute to coagulopathy. Remifentanil infusions are used in some centers, and in older children, TIVA may be used. Antiemetics are extremely important, and in most children, both dexamethasone and ondansetron are administered because postoperative nausea and vomiting not only results in dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, but it can also result in raised ICP, which can be detrimental in these cases. And as is applicable to all neurosurgeries, we have to remember the basic tenets of neuroanesthesia, that is maintaining adequate cerebral perfusion pressure. And therefore, we have to avoid and treat aggressively any episode of hypoxia, hypercapnia, and hypotension. Coming to fluid management, there is no consensus on the type of fluid that has to be administered, and there is a paucity of literature in this area. However, large fluid shifts requiring administration of large volumes of fluids occur commonly in craniofacial surgeries, and crystalloids are generally used for maintenance. There's a theoretical risk of hyponatremia when large volumes of ringer lactate are administered, whereas large volumes of normal saline may result in hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis, and balanced crystalloids may be preferred. This is actually the only study which I could find about fluid replacement in craniofacial pediatric surgery. This was published in Journal of Craniofacial Surgery in 2011. This was a retrospective study of 122 children younger than 5 years of age. 63 of them received normal saline and 59 received ringer lactate. The incidence of hyponatremia, that is sodium less than 135 millimoles per liter, was similar in both the groups, whereas acidosis, including severe acidosis, was more frequent in the normal saline group. So the authors concluded that in young children undergoing craniofacial surgery, ringer lactate may be preferable to normal saline. Colloids may be used to bide time in the face of ongoing blood loss when blood is not yet available. But in general, there's a risk. There's a theoretical concern for colloids contributing to coagulopathy themselves. So, for all practical purposes, crystalloids are used for maintenance, and blood loss is replaced with blood and blood products. So the major intraoperative concerns are massive blood loss, venous air embolism, metabolic and electrolyte disturbances, which may also be a consequence of blood loss, and consequences of massive transfusion. We'll be discussing these. Coming to identification of risk factors for blood loss. So this blood loss may be insidious or it may be acute. And the anesthesiologist should be aware of the surgical steps which have potential for sudden massive blood loss, like initial scalp dissection and raising periosteal flap. So as you can see, blood loss can start early on in the surgery. Therefore, maintaining intravascular volume is extremely crucial to prevent sudden catastrophic cardiovascular collapse. And communication between the surgical and the anesthesia teams is crucial, especially during steps involving major hemorrhage. Some of these cases, blood loss may exceed more than 100% of circulating blood volume. In fact, blood loss reaching up to 500% of circulating blood volume has also been reported in literature. And factors that have been found to increase the likelihood of major blood loss include a younger age and lower weight, along with a disproportionately large head, and prolonged surgery more than 5 hours. So this was a study which was published in Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery in 2020, which found operative time to be the predominant risk factor for transfusion requirements in non-syndromic craniosynostosis repair. These authors found that the mean length of surgery in those who required transfusion more than 25 ml per kg was about 3.8 hours. And surgical time was found to be the predominant independent risk factor for transfusion and non-syndromic craniosynostosis repair. So this is one of the most important reasons why there is a shift towards minimally invasive and endoscopic surgeries whenever feasible in these settings these days. Coming to preventive strategies. Preoperative optimization is the first and foremost thing, and preoperative administration of erythropoietin has been reported in these children. Although the reports are not as abundant as in the adult population, from the reports which are available, the dose range that has been used is 200 to 300 units per kg through the subcutaneous route, administered twice a week for 3 weeks prior to surgery. in addition to supplemental iron and continued post-operatively. Now, I would like to emphasize on the fact that supplemental iron is extremely important along with erythropoietin, because erythropoietin stimulates rapid erythropoiesis, and this might in turn deplete the iron stores if we don't supplement iron. So iron and folic acid as well as vitamin B12 supplementation along with erythropoietin is absolutely essential. And according to the reports which are available, erythropoietin administration was found to be simple and effective. It was found to increase red cell mass in children, and it was found to reduce intraoperative homologous blood transfusion. However, routine use is limited by cost of treatment and availability. Most of the preventive strategies which are used to reduce blood loss in craniosynostosis are they are hindered by their cost effectiveness. There are not a lot of studies which have compared the cost effectiveness of transfusion compared to the cost effectiveness of these strategies. So there is plenty of room for research in these areas. This was a seminal study published by Velarde et al. In the year 1998. No allogenic blood transfusion or NABT protocol for the surgical correction of craniosynostosis. No allogenic blood transfusion protocol was based on pre and postoperative erythropoietin, preoperative autologous blood donation, preoperative normovolemic hemodilution, and intraoperative blood salvage, which was applied to 13 consecutive cases of craniosynostosis repair. And the authors could avoid allogenic blood transfusion in 11 of these 13 children. So they concluded that this protocol may be safely applied to a great majority of children undergoing craniosynostosis repair. Coming to the importance of age selection. So it's not just about the ease of surgery, this has an impact of blood sparing also. If you look at this graph, as the age progresses, the amount of HbF reduces and the amount of HbA increases. Now we know that fetal hemoglobin releases only about 25% oxygen to the tissues, whereas hemoglobin A releases about 50%. And this hemoglobin F concentration starts reducing by 6 to 7 months of life, and it represents about 16% of the total hemoglobin at 4 months of life. Therefore, blood sparing is more likely to be effective at 4 to 6 months of age. Coming to the next blood conservation strategy, that is antifibrinolytics. Tranexamic acid and epsilon aminocaproic acid have been shown to reduce blood loss and transfusion requirements in some studies. Now, both of these are lysine analogs which competitively block conversion of plasminogen to plasmin, thereby preventing subsequent proteolytic action of plasmin on the fibrin clot and stabilizing the fibrin clot. There is no consensus on the dosage of tranexamic acid used in craniosynostosis surgery, and despite its proven benefits, the use is not as widespread as it is in the adult population, owing to concerns about the side effects. We'll be discussing that in a subsequent slide. And the data on efficacy in children is limited compared to that in adults. So this was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial in order to test the efficacy of tranexamic acid in pediatric craniosynostosis surgery by Gooby et al., published in Anesthesiology. 43 patients between 2 months to 6 years of age received either tranexamic acid or placebo, which was 0.9% saline, after induction and prior to surgical incision. The loading dose of 50 mg per kg was given over 15 minutes, followed by an infusion at 5 mg per kg per hour during surgery. The mean blood loss in mean perioperative blood transfusion was significantly reduced in the tranexamic acid group compared to placebo, and tranexamic acid plasma concentrations were maintained above the in vitro thresholds reported for inhibition of fibrinolysis in these cases. The authors concluded that tranexamic acid is effective in reducing perioperative blood loss and transfusion in children undergoing surgical repair of craniosynostosis. Now, most of the concerns about side effects of tranexamic acid can actually be attributed to the fact that there is no consensus on a dosage regimen for tranexamic acid in these patients. If you see 50 mg per kg, 5 mg, 50 mg per kg is quite a steep loading dose. Generally, in adults, we use a loading dose of 10 to 15 mg per kg. So this study was published in British Journal of Anesthesia in 2020. It was designed to compare high dose versus low dose tranexamic acid. It was designed as a non-inferiority trial. So the hypothesis was that low-dose tranexamic acid derived from pharmacokinetic modeling is not inferior to high-dose tranexamic acid in reducing perioperative blood loss and transfusion requirements. The children were randomized to receive either high dose, that is 50 mg per kg, followed by infusion at 5 mg per kg per hour, or low dose, that is 10 mg per kg loading dose, followed by 5 mg per kg per hour. Non-inferiority was taken as 95% confidence interval above the non-inferiority margin of minus 20 ml per kg. and the values were non-inferior regarding blood loss and blood transfusion between both the groups. So they concluded that low-dose tranexamic acid is not inferior to high-dose tranexamic acid in reducing blood loss and transfusion requirements in craniosynostosis surgery, and the incidence of side effects is likely to be lower when a low dose is used. Now, this was an interesting case report that I came across. This was published in Journal of Craniofacial Surgery in 2020. Central retinal artery occlusion following prone transcranial surgery for craniosynostosis and discussion of risk factors. Now, whereas the overall incidence of central retinal artery occlusion following surgery in prone position is an estimated 0.3%, this was found to be 20 times higher, that is 6% in the context of raised ICP and tranexamic acid use. So prone position, raised ICP and tranexamic acid use was found to be a potent combination of risk factors for central retinal artery occlusion. However, having said that, the Pediatric Craniofacial Surgery Perioperative Collaborative Group published a report on the safety of antifibrinolytics in cranial vault reconstructive surgery. This was published in Pediatric Anesthesia. Data from 31 institutions was reported between 2010 to 2015. Antifibrinolytics were administered in 59.5% of these cases. 36.1% of the patients received tranexamic acid and 23.4% received epsilon aminocaproic acid. The overall incidence of postoperative seizures was 0.6%. However, there was no difference in the incidence of seizures between those receiving tranexamic acid and EACA or between those receiving antifibrinolytics and those who were not receiving antifibrinolytics. So this report provides evidence of safety of antifibrinolytics in children undergoing cranial vault reconstruction. However, antifibrinolytic dosage regime should be based on pharmacokinetic data, avoiding unnecessarily high doses. This was a study which reported the use of aminocaproic acid in craniofacial surgery. This was published in 2016. This was a retrospective study of prospectively collected data of children less than 6 years of age who underwent anterior or posterior cranial vault reconstruction surgeries. Data was analyzed for 152 subjects. Perioperative blood loss and transfusion was significantly reduced in those who received aminocaproic acid. Surgical drain output in the first 24 hours was also reduced in those who received aminocaproic acid. And aminocaproic acid is less expensive than tranexamic acid, and it also has a lower predilection for seizures compared to tranexamic acid. So it seems like a prudent idea to use aminocaproic acid if it's available in these cases. This was another study which advocated the PDCA methodology. So this was published in Pediatric Quality and Safety in 2020. PDCA stands for Plan, Do, Check, Act methodology. This was implemented with the aim of reducing perioperative allergenic blood transfusion. The components of this protocol were perioperative temperature management using forced air warmers and fluid warmers to target a temperature of 37 to 37.6 degrees Celsius throughout the procedure. Post-operative transfusion protocol, that is, a decision to transfuse should be based on the decision of the operating surgeon as well as the anesthesiologist, taking into consideration the hemodynamic parameters as well as the hemoglobin of the patient. That is, looking at the patient as a whole and not just looking at the HP. Antifibrinolytic therapy, 12.5 mg per kg tranexamic acid before incision, and pre-incisional injection of 0.25% lidocaine with epinephrine. So the authors found that this bundle resulted in a sustainable decrease in perioperative transfusion requirements in the study population, that is, children less than 24 months of age. Coming to acute normovolemic hemodilution, this refers to the intentional preoperative hemodilution induced by isovolemic exchange of whole blood with either colloids or crystalloids intended to preserve autologous blood while maintaining euvolemia. The basic tenet of ANH is the blood that is lost during surgery will have a lower hematocrit. So based on hematocrit, ANH may be categorized into mild, moderate, or severe. Mild hematocrit of 25 to 30%, moderate hematocrit of 20 to 25%, and severe refers to hematocrit of 20%. ANH was introduced in pediatric practice only in the late 1980s, and it has been found that most children, normal children, can tolerate mild to moderate hemodilution. So the criteria to be met before performing ANH: estimated blood loss should be more than 20% of estimated blood volume. Initial hematocrit should be more than 35. A refusal of homologous blood transfusion by patient or parent, rare blood group, and absence of contraindications such as cardiac or pulmonary disease, severe renal or hepatic disease, active infections, clotting disorders. And while in older children, ANH may be performed under light sedation, but most young infants require general anesthesia before ANH. So the full montage of monitoring has to be instituted before we actually start ANH in these patients, including end-tidal CO2, IBP, ECG, SpO2, CVP, core and peripheral temperatures, urine output, as well as serial hematocrit and lactate monitoring. So blood may be drawn from a suitable peripheral axis or from an arterial or central venous line. Now we know that drawbacks of peripheral axis is very difficult to get a continuous flow of blood, and in most children the central venous lines have a smaller gauge, and because of small gauge and increased length, they offer increased resistance to aspiration. So the most suitable route for withdrawing blood for ANH seems to be an arterial line. So arterial line has to be placed before we actually proceed to do ANH. And we have to take care of the anticoagulant solution ratio for children. There should be only 14 ml of CPDA for 100 ml of whole blood. So anticoagulant solution of the collection bag should be proportional to the amount of blood that we are drawing. And the donated blood should be used within 6 hours if it's kept in the operating room, and within 24 hours if it's stored at 1 to 6 degrees Celsius. So how do we decide as to the volume of blood that has to be withdrawn in small patients? So the most commonly employed formula is the Gross formula. This is the preoperative autologous blood donation volume, but it can also be applied to ANH. So estimated blood volume multiplied by initial hematocrit minus target hematocrit divided by an average of the two. An estimated blood volume is calculated by multiplying body weight with K, which is an age-dependent constant, that is 90 in preterms, 80 in infants up to 24 months, and 75 in toddlers. So when ANH has been performed meticulously, your heart rate, CVP, and arterial blood pressure should be within normal limits, and the child must be warmed adequately, and hyperventilation should be avoided, because we know that hypothermia and respiratory alkalosis can shift the oxygen dissociation curve to the left and reduce offloading of oxygen to the tissues. ANH was part of the NABT protocol that we discussed earlier, in which case the authors were able to successfully avoid allogenic blood transfusions in 11 out of the 13 patients which they included. Preoperative autologous donation is not very widely performed in children, primarily because of the small blood volume of the children, and the criteria is an HB greater than 12. However, for the sake of completion, it is carried out 20 days prior to surgery to allow the patient enough time to recover from post-donation anemia. Blood is drawn once a week, and the last donation should be at least 72 hours prior to the planned surgical procedure. It should not be it should be done at least 3 days prior to the surgery and not after that. Supplementation of erythropoietin and iron, folic acid, and vitamin B12 can offset the anemia associated with preoperative autologous donation, and it should be done whenever PAD or ANH is planned, or even without. Preoperative optimization of anemia has to go hand in hand with other measures. And autologous blood should be used within a specific time period. In most cases, it is 28 days, and indications and contraindications are similar to ANH. Now, the literature that is available, they have found that any of these strategies used in isolation is not as effective as all of them used together. That is why Velarde studies on no allogenic blood transfusion included PAD, ANH, intraoperative blood salvage, as well as preoperative and postoperative erythropoietin. In addition to these, we have to remember the crucial role that is played by perioperative antifibrinolytics in these patients. Coming to intraoperative blood salvage, intraoperative blood salvage from surgical field using either a disposable suction system or an automated centrifuge machine. An automated centrifuge machine is what is used in the present setup in most cases. With the disposable suction system, blood is collected into a sterile plastic bag located within a canister and filtered before being reinfused. The disadvantage, however, with this case is the final hematocrit is very low. It's usually only 13 to 30%. However, hematocrit is higher with the automated devices, in which erythrocytes are washed with saline solution and then reinfused. The drawbacks of IOBS in small children are large volume of the separation chambers and circuits and large priming volume. The priming volume may itself exceed 25 to 35% of the estimated blood volume of these children. Slow processing time of collected blood, which makes it difficult to give the blood in case of massive ongoing blood loss. Rapid reinfusion may not be possible. Low hematocrit of the processed blood and possible hemodynamic overload. Now, some of these problems have been mitigated to a certain extent by advent of 125 ml capacity separation chambers. However, flow rate through these chambers is inadequate and rapid reinfusion is not possible. So this was intraoperative blood salvage was described. The use in craniosynostosis was described for the first time by Jimenez and Baron in 1995. They used the hemolytic cell saver 4 in 18 patients. Compared to the control group, 30% of the patients did not require homologous transfusions and no side effects were observed. The authors concluded that cell saver was safe and effective in this population. This is a typical intraoperative cell salvage setup in an adult patient. There is a specialized dual lumen suction catheter which flushes heparinized solution at its tip. So this is mixed with heparinized saline, goes into a reservoir. From here, it goes into the cell saver or the centrifuge, and the erythrocytes are washed with saline, and the washed RBCs are reinfused back into the patient. So post-operative blood salvage refers to collection of shed blood from the surgical drains into a canister without washing the erythrocytes or using the devices used intraoperatively. Filtering is often not required because blood from an enclosed space is defibrinated and does not clot easily. However, the use in children is limited. There are very few reports. A prominent report of post-operative blood salvage was published by Dahmani et al. In 2000. They demonstrated a reduction in homologous transfusion using a combination of intraoperative blood salvage and postoperative blood salvage in patients operated for craniosynostosis. Now, advances in surgical techniques have also played a significant role in reducing allogenic blood transfusions for craniosynostosis. These include microtip electrocauterization, skin clamps, which help in providing a bloodless incision into the soft tissues and also reduce the time required for hemostasis. One extremely important modification is subgaleal dissection instead of subperiosteal dissection. This limits pericranium incisions along the craniectomy lines, and it has been found to reduce blood loss by 100 to 200 ml, which is a significant amount in small children. Then use of high-speed craniotomes, which reduces the time required for osteotomies. Saline wash and application of bone wax along the osteotomy lines to control bleeding, and use of fibrin glues. Then oxidized cellulose and gelatin for oozing dural sites. Then modifications in surgical techniques also includes a shift towards less invasive procedures like spring-assisted cranioplasty, endoscopic procedures, gradual destruction devices. And as I've mentioned earlier, the one added advantage of these procedures is a reduced incidence of venous air embolism that is associated with endoscopic procedures. Now, this is another relatively new technology, non-invasive hemoglobin monitoring. It has not been widely studied in the pediatric population. So this was a study which was published in Anesthesia Analgesia 2012. They wanted to assess the accuracy of non-invasive hemoglobin monitoring using the Radical 7 pulse co-oximeter in children undergoing neurosurgery. If you see, this is the Masimo device which is used for measuring this SpHb. So this is a continuous non-invasive hemoglobin as opposed to the intermittent measurements that we take from the blood gas, which may be confounded by volume shifts and rapid volume resuscitation. So children less than 12 years of age diagnosed with brain tumors, craniosynostosis or moya-moya disease were included in the study. An arterial line was placed in all patients. 119 paired sample, that is difference between SpHb and the total hemoglobin derived from standard laboratory measurement. And the change in SpHb and change in total hemoglobin between two consecutive measures were analyzed. The correlation coefficient between SpHb and THb was 0.58, and the average difference between the two, that is bias, was about 0.9 gram per deciliter. But what the authors found was the bias was significantly higher when HB was less than 9 gram per deciliter. That is, when the actual hemoglobin is lower than 9, your radical Masimo pulse co-oximeter may overestimate the hemoglobin. So caution has to be exercised while deciding upon transfusion based solely on SpHb. It cannot be used alone to make decisions pertaining to transfusion. However, the authors concluded that the Radical 7 pulse co-oximeter can be used as a reliable trend monitor in children undergoing neurosurgery, even immediately after volume expansion. Now, coming to the actual management of blood loss, one drawback in children is direct assessment of blood volume loss may be very difficult because a lot of the blood collects in the drapes and surrounding areas, and we may not be able to estimate blood loss correctly by what is collected in the suction. So estimation of blood volume loss often depends on the amount of resuscitation fluids and blood products transfused. In a hemodynamically unstable patient, hemodynamic parameters are used to guide transfusion. However, vigilance is required to detect alternate causes of hypotension like venous air embolism or anaphylaxis, and transfusion triggers are used in hemodynamically stable patients. However, there is a wide variation between transfusion triggers between various centers. In general, a hemoglobin of 7 to 8 gram per deciliter or hematocrit of 27 to 30% is often used as a transfusion trigger. Now, Cortellazzi et al. In 2009 advocated something known as the early transfusion strategy. After coronal opening, 20% of the estimated blood volume that was calculated using gross formula was replaced with blood, along with 1/3 of this volume using fresh frozen plasma and a simultaneous crystalloid infusion at 8 ml per kg per hour. However, this strategy has drawn flag because of the potential risk of volume overload in small children and also unnecessary transfusion. And massive transfusion itself may result in coagulopathy. So indications for administration of hemostatic products include a PT or APTT more than 1.5 times normal, fibrinogen less than 0.8 to 1 gram per liter, platelet count less than 50 to 80,000 per microliter, and clinical evidence of coagulopathy. And hemostatic products may be administered arbitrarily when blood loss exceeds 1.5 times the estimated blood volume in order to prevent dilutional coagulopathy, which results in a vicious cycle. And for all surgical procedures, except for very minor ones, cross-matched blood should be available in the operating room prior to surgical incision. Coming to the next most common complication, next most dreaded and common complication in craniosynostosis surgery, venous air embolism. It is most likely to occur when the head is positioned above the level of the heart and dural venous sinuses are exposed. Incidence in craniosynostosis approaches 83%. However, fortunately, most of these cases are not associated with hemodynamic instability. Precordial Doppler is recommended for detection, but most centers rely on capnography. We know that a sudden decrease in EtCO2 is suggestive of venous air embolism. Preoperative central venous line should be considered in patients at high risk of VA, especially very small children, patients who are positioned in prone position, modified prone position with head and neck hyperextended. And in 1 to 2% of patients, rapid cardiovascular collapse can occur. So the management is largely supportive and includes notifying the surgeon and flooding the surgical field with saline to prevent further entrapment of air, using 100% oxygen, discontinuation of nitrous oxide if in use, positioning head below the level of the heart, Valsalva maneuver with manual ventilation, and there are reports of chest compressions being helpful even if not in cardiac arrest because they help break the air bubbles. Supportive treatment for cardiovascular compromise in the form of vasopressors and inotropes, and pediatric advanced life support protocol for cardiac arrest. So this is the PALS cardiac arrest algorithm, which was published in 2020. The notable differences are obviously the dose of shock. The first shock is for a shockable rhythm. The first shock is 2 joules per kg. Second shock is 4 joules per kg, and subsequent shocks are greater than 4 joules per kg. Maximum 10 joule per kg or adult dose. And the compression ventilation ratio in children is 15:2 if there is no advanced airway, as opposed to 30:2 in children. Also, the doses of epinephrine has to be kept in mind. Now, coming to post-operative management, majority of the patients may be extubated in the theater or immediate post-operative period. However, factors which favor post-operative ventilation include prolonged surgery, especially more than 5 hours, large fluid shifts, massive blood transfusion, effects of prolonged surgery in prone position like airway edema, and patient factors when already there was preoperative airway obstruction or obstructive sleep apnea or difficult airway. In those cases, post-operative ventilation should be considered. Most patients, even if extubated, require post-op ICU or HDU care with close monitoring of hematological parameters. And drain losses and blood gas parameters, in addition to hemodynamic parameters, should be closely monitored in order to manage transfusion and indicated. The importance of adequate analgesia cannot be overemphasized because inadequate analgesia can lead to, inadequate analgesia and pain can result in vasoconstriction, rise in SVR, increase in afterload, and it can have an overall detrimental effect on the child's well-being. So paracetamol and intravenous opiates are generally used, and there have been reports of nurse-controlled morphine analgesia as well. The role of NSAIDs is controversial because of their effect on platelet function. Postoperative nausea vomiting is another concern. Vomiting may increase ICP in addition to causing dehydration and electrolyte disturbances. So most of the cases, dual antiemetics, dexamethasone along with ondansetron is recommended. Electrolyte imbalances are common in the postoperative period, especially hyponatremia, but because of large volume transfusion, hypocalcemia, hypo or hyperkalemia can also occur. Now, hyponatremia is believed to be because of SIADH due to surgical manipulation or large volume administration of hypotonic saline. Also, large volume shifts, which are commonly seen in these surgeries. Hyponatremia may be asymptomatic or it may cause seizures and cerebral edema, and it should be treated promptly. There are certain factors which have been found to be associated with postoperative hyponatremia. These are preoperative raised ICP, large volume transfusions, syndromic craniosynostosis, and female gender regardless of ICP. This was a study which was published in 2015 in the journal Anesthesiology. They wanted to find out predictors of clinically significant postoperative events after open craniosynostosis surgery. The authors were of the opinion that even though patients who undergo craniosynostosis surgery are shifted to ICU routinely, we have to think about the cost of ICU care. So is there a way in which we can stratify these patients into risk categories and decide which patients require ICU care and which patients do not? So these authors identified 6 factors. The multivariate analysis included 6 factors, which were a body weight less than 10 kg, ASA class 3 or 4, packed red cell transfusion more than 60 ml per kg, intraoperative complications such as hypotension, arrhythmias, venous air embolism, hemostatic blood product administration, and not using tranexamic acid. So when all 6 of these were present, probability of a significant hematological or cardiorespiratory event was 97%, whereas when none of the factors was present, it was only 10%. So in conclusion, anesthetic management of surgical repair of craniosynostosis may pose several challenges. A comprehensive multidisciplinary approach is essential to ensure good outcomes. Adequate preoperative planning, especially pertaining to airway management and strategies to minimize and manage blood loss, are essential. Optimal positioning and antifibrinolytics play a major role in minimizing blood loss. Invasive vascular access is considered mandatory in most centers. Advancements in surgical techniques have also reduced the requirement for perioperative transfusion, and postoperative care in ICU or HDU with close monitoring of hemodynamic, hematological, and coagulation parameters is recommended in most cases. However, a risk stratification approach may be used. Postoperative concerns include electrolyte and metabolic derangements, inadequate analgesia, and postoperative nausea, vomiting. And there is a paucity of literature in areas other than blood management and craniosynostosis, leaving room for future research. Thank you.